For everyone who has joined so far, thank you for joining us today. My name is Malvika Rendive. I am a program coordinator here with SID-United States. And the event today is called Localization, the Road Ahead for USAID's Localization Efforts. This event is a collaboration between three different work groups: the Policy and Learning Work Group, the Inclusive Development Work Group, and the Digital Development Work Group. A few things before we get started today. A little about SID-United States. If you're not familiar with us and this is your first event attending, welcome. We are the largest and the most active chapter of the Society for International Development, which is an international network founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral and independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community, as we are doing today. There are a few different ways that you can get involved with us. You can check some of our upcoming events and sign up for a weekly newsletter by visiting our website, which is listed on the slide, but it is www.sid-us.org. You can apply to be a volunteer co-chair or work group or network associate. You can find more information about this on our website as well. Or you can follow us on social media and keep in touch with all of our different activities. A few things to note for today's session. This is a recorded session and will be shared publicly through our different social media channels and networks. Closed captioning is available to you through your individual settings, and you can turn it on. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please post them in the chat box. We will keep a track of them, and I urge the speakers to try to answer as many as possible, but we do understand there is a time crunch, so we may not be able to answer all, and we apologize for that. I will now turn it over to Lindsay Moore, who is one of the co-chairs of the Policy and Learning Work Group. And for your reference here, these are also some of our other work group co-chairs that have contributed to this event.
Great. Thank you so much, Malvika. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about this session. My name is Lindsay Moore. I am CEO of Develop Metrics, and I'm also co-chair of the Policy and Learning Working Group at SID. So I'm just going to introduce our session really quickly today. We'll be starting with two speakers from USAID. We're really fortunate to have Sarah Rose, who is the Senior Advisor for Localization at USAID. Prior to that position, she was a fellow at the Center for Global Development, focusing on development policy and aid effectiveness, including localization. And she's also served in many other roles, a monitoring and evaluation specialist in the Health Office of USAID Mozambique, and was also working at MCC in the Department of Policy and Evaluation. We're also lucky to have Arjun, who is the New Partnerships Initiative Lead at the Local Faith and Transformative Partnership Hub in DDI. And prior, Arjun led E3's LS policy engagement, and he also led E3's Local Works program, providing direct support to USAID missions. Interestingly, Arjun also has a lot of other experience, including being a teacher in a refugee camp, communication roles on political campaigns, and a policy analyst at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. So very excited to have these speakers to kick us off and provide their perspectives on the USAID's localization policy. I'll then be kicking it over to Amy Johnson, my co-chair, who will be introducing our esteemed moderators who will be leading our breakout groups. We'll have two breakout groups. One led by Mina will be discussing what is working well. And another one led by Sam will be talking more about what needs to happen to reach true inclusion in localization efforts. So with that, I will pass it over to Sarah to provide her insights on localization. Thanks so much.
But I am just really glad for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I really want to thank SID-US, especially the working groups on policy and learning, development, and digital development for organizing. And I actually think it's very interesting that the span of interest, right? And I think what that really underscores is this cross-cutting nature of localization. So glad to be able to have the chance to chat with you all today. And I also just want to thank everyone else here who's participating for sharing your time. I'm really happy to be able to have the chance to engage with all of you on this important topic of localization. And I'm particularly looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. It really does take all of us in all of our various roles to advance locally led development. And so it's always so helpful to be able to have the opportunity to come together and talk about where we are, where we want to go, opportunities for getting there, as well as the barriers that we'll need to overcome. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this session is called The Road Ahead for USAID's localization efforts. So I wanted to just start out by taking a few minutes to sort of situate where we are on this journey. And by doing so, let me just quickly highlight USAID's localization progress report for fiscal year 2022. So this actually went up back in June. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll encourage you to check it out. And what I'll do is go over some top lines today, but there's a whole lot more data and detail in the report that you might find interesting. And so what this report really does is it provides an update of the first sort of year plus since Administrator Power announced USAID's recommitment to localization. And the report focuses primarily on, where we are as an agency on the two targets that Administrator Power challenged USAID to meet. And these are, of course, that, we will aim to channel at least a quarter of our funding directly through local partners, and that at least half of our programs will be locally led. And so we'll talk quickly through both of those angles today. And so next slide, please. So the report really focuses on, I'm going to talk about the funding angle first. The report focuses on three types of direct funding that support USAID localization priorities. And these are direct funding to local partners, direct funding to regional partners, as well as government-to-government assistance. And I will talk about each of those in turn. Next slide, please. Perfect. So in fiscal year 2022, USAID recorded the highest level and percent of direct local funding in over a decade. And that is since we've been able to track our funding in this way using the systems that we have now. We are currently at just over 10% of direct local funding, and that's compared, of course, to our agency-wide target of 25%. So, what this shows is that we do have a way to go. But I also just want to highlight that, just in the last year, looking year on year between fiscal year 2021 and 22, direct local funding increased by $623 million. And this is actually a 66% year-on-year increase in dollar value terms. So it's nice to see that we're heading in the right track, even as we have a way to go to get to our goal. Next slide, please. Hi, I think I just got kicked out and I'm back in. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Again, the technical issues continue. So unsurprisingly, most direct local funding is obligated by missions because missions have the in-country staff, they have the connections, in country, they have an operational model that is generally more conducive to forming these kinds of partnerships with local partners. And so if we look just at our mission funding, what we see is that 18% of our obligations went directly to local partners. Next slide, please. So looking by sector, what we see is that health is the clear leader, and nearly 20% of our obligations in health went directly to local partners. And actually what this reflects in large part has been the push by PEPFAR and USAID's HIV programs, or under PEPFAR, over the last 5 years to channel the majority of its funding directly through local partners and partner governments. More than half of USAID's FY22 direct local funding is actually attributable to PEPFAR programs. And to me, what I see in this is something that's really encouraging. So over the last 4 years, USAID's HIV work has more than doubled the number of prime local partners and nearly doubled the amount of funding going to local partners. And in a way, this is a great demonstration case, because what it shows is that, when you have a target to work towards, as PEPFAR has since 2018, as well as real intentionality, we are really able to shift how we work to working more locally. I also want to highlight economic growth, which is, of course, smaller than health, but it's doubled the percentage of local funding in the last 2 years since FY20. Next slide, please. So regionally, we see that missions in Africa provide the most direct funding to local partners. This is both in dollar and percentage terms. In FY22, they hit nearly 24% of their funding going to local actors. And again, this is partly because the Africa region is USAID's largest, both in terms of funding outlays, but it's also linked to PEPFAR's push for direct local funding, since the majority of USAID's PEPFAR programs are in Africa. But I also want to highlight that the Latin America and Caribbean region, as well as Asia, have made notable gains. And one thing I'll note, which is not reflected on this graph, because this graph displays only the percent local funding rather than levels. But looking at the dollar value, what we see is that missions in Latin America and the Caribbean have nearly doubled the amount of money going to local partners between FY20 and FY22. Next slide, please. So I want to take just a quick second to talk about local organizations who are working outside of their country, but within their broader region. So this group of partners doesn't actually end up accounting for much of USAID's funding. It's just under $60 million in FY22, but they're really important philosophically to how we think about localization. So first of all, the issues that local change agents work on, they may cross borders. If you think about things like pandemic preparedness or biodiversity or supply chain, these are very naturally regional in scope. And second, we also know that some organizations, that work in countries with very difficult operating environments, they may need to register and incorporate in a neighboring country for security purposes. But we want to make sure that we are acknowledging and capturing these types of relationships and how we're tracking what it means to be local. So next slide, please. So the last type of direct funding that I want to discuss is government to government, or G2G. So governments, of course, at all levels are so central to the goals of improving public goods or sustaining service delivery at scale. And so USAID is able to partner directly with some governments that meet certain criteria that are outlined in legislation. Last year in FY22, USAID provided nearly $200 million in project-based government-to-government assistance to 17 countries. And what we see is that, levels of obligations to government programs have really varied over the years. But one of the constants in the last few years is that the bulk of our G2G funding has been in support of health objectives. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do now is shift a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about the direct funding side of things, but now let's talk a little bit about how we're going to measure shifting power and creating space for local leadership in our programs. This is, of course, the second goal that Administrator Power highlighted when she announced USAID's recommitment to localization. And I'm actually really excited about this part, both of the progress reports and this part of sort of where we are in thinking about how we're thinking about our progress towards localization. Because what it does is it puts us in a better space to really highlight the equal importance of this target around local leadership alongside the direct funding target, as well as how the two targets really complement one another. So first of all, there are ways that we can have direct funding relationships that might give more or less space for that funding recipient to be able to exercise agency or decision-making over the use of funds. And also just more broadly, there are ways sort of across the many ways that USAID might work with local actors, whether they're prime partners, whether they're sub-partners, whether they're participants in a USAID program, or whether they're members of a community that might be affected by USAID programming. So there are ways across all of these types of relationships to ensure space for local voices, for local leadership and local decision-making power over what it is that we're doing. So the trick is that we didn't have an existing way to measure local leadership as a concept, nor an obvious data source for this. So we asked. Next slide, please. So between November of 2022 and March of 2023, what we did is we engaged over 300 organizations, including US-based partners, including local partners, including local community-based organizations, many of whom do not have an existing relationship with USAID. We also engaged USAID staff, including staff from 22 missions. And we asked them, what are the kinds of practices that USAID as an agency can undertake that really sort of meaningfully and visibly move the needle when it comes to creating the space for local actors to be able to exercise leadership. And so what we did is we took the ideas that emerged from these engagements, we qualitatively coded everything that we heard, and from there we were able to identify some cross-cutting themes and then rank these specific actions for elevating local leadership that were seen as most and least valued. And what our analysis showed was, a strong demand for early and inclusive engagement with communities, the desire for shifting power to local communities through direct partnerships, as well as really a deep appreciation for asset-based approaches, which really recognize, leverage, and capitalize on local expertise as well. Next slide, please. So using these engagements, as a foundation, right, what we did is that we came up with a framework for measurement and for tracking that focuses on 4 categories of approaches through which USAID can enable greater local leadership over its activities. And so these categories, look at things like the number of activities. And by activity, what I mean here is basically a project or an implementing mechanism. The number of activities with a direct local prime awardee. And this really complements the dollar value that we're tracking with our direct funding indicator. The second category really looks at how we partner with local partners when we have these direct funding relationships with them. How are we encouraging partner designed activities in ways that can really elevate these partners' decision making? How are we making sure that we're partnering with them in ways that help strengthen the capacity of that partner as well? The third category that we're looking at is again, how we're strengthening local capacity. How are we leveraging, elevating existing capacity? How are we using local knowledge, and how are we helping to support and strengthen their demands or their desires for strengthening their expertise as well? And then the fourth category really looks at, how is USAID and its implementing partners engaging communities directly, including thinking about how can we expand the use of inclusive and participatory approaches throughout our programs. So next slide, please. So under each of these four categories, there are several good practices that USAID and its implementing partners can use throughout USAID's program cycle. I'm not going to list them all. I would be very happy to talk about some of these as part of the discussion. But you can see some of these practices, again, that emerge from the consultations as high priority. What I will say is that, when we report on this indicator, in terms of reporting against, our target that at least half of our programs will be locally led, what we will do is report data on how many of our programs, how many of our activities use each of these practices in a given fiscal year. We will also identify the percentage of USAID programs that can demonstrate the use of two or more of these listed good practices across two of the four categories. And so there's really two purposes to this indicator. One is, of course, accountability, towards this target that we've set forth. In that case, we're looking again for activities that have two of these practices. But also, this is a tool that is going to be very useful, again, for USAID and its implementing partners, just to look granularly at each of these individual good practices and understand the extent to which we are using them, where, when, and in what context, et cetera. So let me just flag that not all of the practices that we've identified, as among this list of 14 good practices is going to be relevant for all programs. Not for all award types, not for all agreement types, or all operating contexts. And so what we see this range of practices as is really sort of a menu of options for missions, for implementing partners, for local stakeholders and communities to think about referencing and leveraging, as best suits their needs, their opportunities, and their constraints. So let me take a minute now to highlight some next steps on this. So right now, at this very moment, we have teams who are working to establish some very specific and operational definitions tied to each of these practices. We anticipate being able to share that publicly in the coming weeks, sometime in September. And then what we're doing is going to pilot data collection this fall. And I will say that this year is going to be a learning, right? This is the first time we're attempting to do something of this sort of scale and scope and this focus. And so I think that we should expect some learning and some adaptation and processes over time. And we will, of course, look forward to continuing the conversation with you all as we do and to help inform our learning as well. I also want to reiterate that, again, we have this list of 14 good practices, but this is not an exhaustive list of things that can move the needle on advancing locally led development. That is just too much to ask of any individual indicator. Yes, we do have these targets as an agency. They're very important accountability tools. They're useful signposts to help direct and encourage our work. And even though I've just spent, a lot of time talking about indicators and targets, like localization is not just about these indicators, right? Localization is about ensuring that the way that USAID and its partners, engage with local actors is inclusive, ensures that it's respectful of the time and the resources of those that we engage. It's about having an open door and being able to create space for these, proactive conversations with local partners. It's about having, the staff as well as the staff skills to be able to do that. It's about relationships. It's about building trust, and it's fundamentally about systems and culture change as well. So, just the small stuff. So over the last year and a half, though, what we have been doing is taking steps to try to enable these things, right? Through our human resources, through policy and strategy foundations that will help underpin our progress towards these localization goals. So let me just highlight a couple of these, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague to do a little bit of a deeper dive into one of these that we see as very important and very much anchoring some of the localization work. But first, I think, as many of you may have seen, we have a new acquisitions and assistance strategy out. And what this does is it really outlines the shifts in our business practices, that will help make us more accessible, sort of more flexible, as well as a better partner to all partners, not just local partners, but with a focus on local partners as well, with the idea that we're moving towards, as a goal, as an agency, greater locally led and more sustainable development. The acquisitions and assistance strategy also focuses, very much internally on our staff, right, and our need and our imperative to be able to staff up, especially among our acquisitions and assistance staff. We have a new risk appetite statement, or a newly revised risk appetite statement, which highlights or articulates this high appetite that we have as an agency for taking smart and disciplined risks when it comes to working with local partners, because of the opportunities that we see for more equitable and more sustained development outcomes when local actors are in the lead. We also have a relatively new, now I guess it's getting close to a year old, local capacity strengthening policy. And what this policy does is it really commits USAID to emphasizing capacity strengthening as an important outcome in and of itself, and to approach it in a way that is demand-driven and based on the assets that an organization currently has. And this policy, in a lot of ways, gets really at the heart of what we're trying to do with localization. How can we help to support strong and resilient local systems that are going to advance well-being for the communities and the countries in which they are located, in which they serve? So let me turn it over now to my colleague, Arjun Tasker, and he can talk a little bit more about where we are with a local capacity strengthening policy, again, since it's been almost a year since the policy launched. So Arjun, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Let me get a sound check. And everyone, someone give a thumbs up. Can you hear me? All right, great. I am very glad to be here. My name is Arjun Tasker. Lindsay, I'm gonna have to find out where you found that bio. But yes, I do indeed run the New Partnerships Initiative, and I was thrilled to be able to shepherd the local capacity strengthening policy into existence, and I'm now a member of its implementation team. And so I'm just gonna very briefly touch on this, because I know we've taken up a lot of your time. I think we did a lot of publicity around the policy, so I won't go dive into it. But I think, as Sarah was talking about, one of the key characteristics and the reason I'm proud of it is that it does emphasize being asset-based. It does talk about mutuality. It is trying to ensure that investing in capacity, it doesn't perpetuate inequitable relationships between donors and anyone with whom we are working. However, its policy, it sets an enabling environment. It doesn't do anything in and of itself. And so we have to figure out how to implement it and how to ensure that staff within USAID are able to implement it, and try to listen and hear from people who work with us, whether or not we're sort of living up to this policy. This is one of the few policies which have some resources to try to do those things. And so we have leadership level buy-in. We have built an implementation team that goes across the bureaus. We've started building also resources that can elevate knowledge about what we're talking about in the policy, because sort of what people think of as capacity strengthening work varies widely just within our agency, certainly depending on whether it's technically in terms of a technical sector, or it's because you're talking to people who are writing contracts and they think of it very differently than someone who is implementing or working with an implementing partner on a development project. One of the things I'd want to highlight here is our micro trainings, which are publicly available. You will notice that a lot of our materials, and we've tried to make as much as possible publicly available, is aimed at mission staff. But in reviewing all of it, we made sure to get it cleared and made it public, because I think it's extremely useful in and of itself. And also it's good to know what we're telling our colleagues in the mission. It's good for you to know. And so you can find a lot of that on USAID.gov, and also the micro trainings are on Learning Lab. And one last thing you'll find on USAID.gov is a document called Implementation Updates. And we will make a new version of that in the next calendar year, but it talks about sort of what we are working on and what we hope to be working on sort of short term, and hopefully we can keep updating that so people are aware of how we're trying to go about doing this. Let's go to the next slide. One of the biggest things we're doing and hope to do annually is a learning and feedback forum on the policy. You can find more information on the website. You can register. There will likely be a few different side events. Selma, I see your question. I will both provide it to Lindsay so it can be sent afterward, and then when someone else is speaking, I'll throw it in the chat as well. We're really excited about this event. It's tricky for us to get permission to put on this kind of event, so I'm also proud about being able to make that happen. And we really envision it as something that allows us to hear from both our colleagues and from all different types of stakeholders, so we can then update how we're implementing this policy. Do we need to spend more time on educating our own staff? Do they understand the policy? Is that translating to solicitations and to activity mail plans and to the actual work happening? Do local actors who may be part of an activity that's investing in capacity think it's being done in alignment with the policy? I don't know. And there are a lot of other questions besides just those few. And so hopefully we can start answering some of those questions at this forum. And with that, I will turn it back to Lindsay. Thanks, everyone.